So hi, and welcome to a quick tutorial for the database of religious history. My name's Willis Monroe. I'm the Associate Director of the project, and I'm here with Matt Hamm, who is one of our postdoc fellows and also an editor for East Asia. So we're going to go through a little bit of the project and show us some demos of the actual features of the website. So just to start with a quick plan, I'm going to introduce the DRH, give a little bit of its history and background. And then from there, we'll move into these actual kind of tutorial sections where we look at how to browse the database, how to actually read through an entry and get a good sense for what data is contained within. And then we'll finish up by just looking at the tools that we've built that allow you to search and visualize the data. Now, the project is open access, so if you have time, if you have the capacity, you're welcome to follow along at religiondatabase.org, which is our URL. Or visit it later. It's always there. You don't need an account. You can just visit it and browse, read entries, or search at any time. So the project itself is a little bit complex. We like this little tagline I have here on the screen. The world's first comprehensive online quantitative and qualitative encyclopedia of religious cultural history. And so what that means is that the database contains many entries that are entered by experts in their fields, but those entries consist of answers that are quantitative and qualitative in nature. And you'll get a better sense for that in a little bit. So the project started kind of around 2014. It's really been kind of growing ever since. At this point, we've got almost 300 experts who have entered data with us, and they've written over 500 entries. And I just pulled this data today, so it's very current. And all of that together results in about just over 100,000 individual points of data. So 100,000 expert perspectives on the history of religions throughout the world. Guiding that creation of data is an editorial board of just about 30 academics who help recruit experts from various fields and also oversee their work for the project. And as I mentioned before, it's an open access platform, so there's no kind of barriers to you getting at the data. We also have an active Twitter account at Religion History you can follow for updates on the project. So when we're talking about the project, when you're talking about such a large kind of ambitious attempt to catalog all this information, we have to have some terms and some ontologies. And so just to give you an example, and you can read much more about this on our website, we have one category we call a religious group. This is our first category that we started collecting data for. And we've come up with this very kind of loose definition. So a community or network of people who share common practices, beliefs, and/or institutions, but they're not necessarily members of an explicitly recognized group, and so on. And so we've made an effort as a project to really make sure that these terms, that these definitions are as widely defined as possible so that we can really bring in experts from around the world who are not just coming from a particular academic tradition or a particular disciplinary background, but can approach the project from a wide range of areas and kind of historical terminologies, right? So religious group is our main poll that we started with. Since then, we've also added a religious place poll and more recently a religious text poll. And so when experts sign up with the project, they're actually entering data in one of these polls. They're answering questions that come from one of these polls. But the questions are linked behind the scenes so that when you search for a particular question, you're going to get answers in other polls as well. And we'll see more about that later on. So the entries themselves, we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in an interactive way in a little bit. But every entry has a title, including alternate names. It's got what we call a religious tagging tree. These are terms that the expert uses to define their entry, maybe terms that they learned in grad school or terms that are common in their particular field. They write a description of their entry. So they give us a kind of narrative description of what their entry covers. They give us the source of where their data is coming from. In most cases, this is the expert's own research, their own work, but they might be also pulling from external resources. They define a map, and this is a really critical feature. They draw a polygon, one or more polygons on a global map to say that the answers they're providing come from this area. They also give a date range. So similarly, the answers they're providing fit within this date range. And finally, they add some geographical tags. So where in the world is this? So if you're interested in religious groups in Ireland, you can look for the tag Ireland, right? And you'll find different religious groups. All of these details of an entry are set by default when an entry is created. But the really crucial thing is that you can change any one of them per answer, right? So by default, they're going to apply to everything. But if one of the questions is asking you about a certain aspect of the belief in the religious group, and that belief changes critically at an important juncture, you can go in and change the date range for an answer, or answer twice, once for the earlier date range, once for the later date range. And this ability allows us to actually really encode the very messy nature of the historical record, right? You can't just answer these blanket answers across all time and space. You have to have this kind of configurability to show the nuance behind the sources. And so this allows experts to really play with how their entry is displayed in the database by answering multiple times, by changing these variables, etc. So more on these questions and answers. As I mentioned, we have these three major polls: group, place, and text. Each one is made up of a set of questions. These questions are about 400 to 500 on average per poll. The experts can answer these questions. They answer yes, no, field doesn't know, or I don't know. And then there's lots of room for qualitative answers. So room for them to write a whole paragraph why saying yes is really hard for this time period, right? Or saying no is hard for this time period. Or adding in sources. So there's the ability to add citations as well and build a rich bibliography of the entry. They can also add rich media, and we'll see some good examples of this later on. So is there a particular photograph or image or scan of a manuscript that is important for this answer? Well, you can add it in the qualitative section for the answer. Okay, so we're going to move now to the demos. So we're going to have to do a little flip and flopping between screen shares. We're going to start with a demo on browse. So Matt's going to cover how to browse the database and how to read an entry. And then we'll return to me to look at how to search and visualize the data. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me turn on the sharing. There we go. Okay, so as Willis said, we'd like to start the demo with just a brief description of how to browse the database. So this does not require an account, and it's all open access, so no paywalls or any other obstacles. So there are three basic ways to browse. You can go by author, region, or poll type, so religious place, and then we have the other poll types here. If you select author, the database will bring up all of the entries, and then we'll just list them alphabetically by author's last name. And then on the left, which I'm sorry, it's loading, taking a little bit of time to load here, but on the left, it'll bring it up as a column of the alphabet, so you can jump around, click whatever letters you need if you want to jump around. All right, and I'll skip over to region, sorry about that. So if you browse by region, it's the same idea. It's going to be alphabetical by region, and then all of the entries listed under each region. Now, one difference for this from the author function is that you might see entries recurring in multiple regions, and that's because it might fit into different regions, and so we repeat as necessary. When you're using this function, there are also then other ways to organize or filter it. So right now I've got it sorted by name, but you can also sort it chronologically. So either by the date at which the entry begins or the date at which it ends. So if you do this, everything is still going to be grouped by region, but then within each region, the entries are going to be reorganized into chronological order. If you want to get a little more specific in your browsing, you can also filter. So you can select a specific date range that you're interested in and then kind of browse and see what's happening in the world in different regions at around that time. So if we do, for example, 500 BCE to 500 CE, that's going to bring up all of the entries in different regions for that time period. And if you want to make it even more specific, you can only include select polls. So in this case, if I only want to look at religious group polls, then it will only bring up those entries in different regions at that time. So the last way then that you can browse is by poll type. And I'm going to just get rid of this filtering here. So starting with religious group. Now, if you select poll type, you'll see that the entries get reorganized according to the tags that experts add that Willis was mentioning earlier. And as with the region browsing, you're going to see entries coming up multiple times because they're going to be associated with multiple tags. And as with the other entries, again, you're going to see the complete list come up on the left so that you can jump around or just scroll through and see what comes up. Now, in the case of religious group, so this was our first poll, as Willis said, so the tagging tree is quite extensive because it was created ahead of time. However, experts can add their own tags that then become available for use by other experts, and so the tagging tree is kind of ever expanding. So if we go to our newest poll, religious text, you'll see that we have a very small tagging tree. And that's because we don't have a lot of entries yet in this poll, but they're going to keep growing, and so the tagging tree is going to keep expanding. Now, the final thing I want to mention in terms of browsing is that you can is the search function, and I'm actually going to do this with preloaded pages because my computer is a little slow. So if you want to, browse by a certain term, you can type it in. The database will give some suggestions of related terms that we have. And then it's going to bring up every entry that features that term. So take kind of a big one in East Asian studies. If we look at Confucian for, Confucian thought or Confucianism, it's going to bring up all of the entries that are related to that. Not surprisingly, in this case, all of them are in East Asia, but the search does apply across all regions. So if you wanted to do a different term, say Christianity, that's going to bring up traditions and entries in all different regions that you can then scroll through. And once you've brought those up, you can also sort them using the features that I mentioned earlier, so by name or the date. Okay. So that's the basics in terms of browsing and searching the database. And I want to go into a little more detail about the entries that you're going to see once you start doing this, starting with the religious group poll. So the example that I've chosen is just an excellent entry on Sino-Christian theology. And this is a good example of the flexibility of the religious group poll, as Willis was mentioning earlier. It doesn't have to be a community that's sort of self-defined, located in very specific place and time. In this case, Sino-Christian theology is a more diffuse movement or phenomenon in East Asia, and the author has been able to use the group poll to sort of capture that information and give us a really interesting window into the spread of Christianity in China and indigenous adaptations of it. So this is what I like about this entry is that it's very well annotated. So we start off with an opening paragraph here that kind of introduces the topic and gives an overview. And it shows you how you can use the survey questions for statistical analysis, but they also give you a framework to provide a lot of information through the notes. So these notes help to contextualize and add nuance to the answers. And then they also give you a way to kind of direct readers to further resources. So in this case, the author has included links to online lectures that pertain to this subject. And so if you're looking at a particular question, you immediately have areas that you can explore to learn more about it. And you can also do that right up front through adding additional sources if people want to investigate it in more depth. So there's a lot of flexible ways to provide information. The next poll type is religious place, and this enables one to capture very, very specific data and to also take a more materialist approach because most of the questions are going to be about the physical features of a specific religious site. So in this case, we have the Sokoji, which is the Shoto Zen mission of San Francisco that was founded in 1934. So this is kind of one of the major sites for Zen history in America. And it's a nice counterpart, right, to the entry we just looked at, because instead of looking at the diffusion of a Western religion into East Asia, we can look at an East Asian religion spreading into the West, in this case, into North America. What I think is particularly great about this entry is it showcases the media options that Willis was mentioning. So this author has a number of photos of the site that they've uploaded. And each of these photos is attached to a specific question, but then you can also see them all up front. So in this case, we can jump to this question, right? So they're talking a little bit about the worship that occurs at the site, and then they have a photo of what that would look like. And in addition to the comments that annotate the question, the photos themselves have space for citations and descriptions as well. The final poll type, this is again our newest poll, religious text. And this one is on a very important text from China, the Chuzi Zhangzhu. And this is an interesting work because it's not only very influential in East Asian history, but it's also quite a difficult text to interpret. And it's a difficult text to access, I think. And the author has done a great job of kind of using the entry as a way to sort of make what is very tricky content very accessible. And they've been able to do that in terms of the materiality of the text, the production and context of the text, and then also a lot about its beliefs and practices. And I think this text also is a good example of sort of things that can be included in the database that might be missed with other approaches, because this text is actually frequently read as a literary compilation. It's a compilation of poetry. But as the author of the entry notes, it is probably best understood as a literary reworking of religious themes. And so having an entry on it not only gives us insight into Chinese religious, or sorry, into the text itself, but also just Chinese religious history in general. And so just to give an example of this, we have this question here: are there practices that have funerary associations presented in the text? Yes, there are, and the author explains how these were religious practices at the time that then sort of got represented and folded into the sort of literary reworking of the text as it was put together over time.
Great, thank you, Matt. That was a very comprehensive overview of the browsing and the entries. So I'm going to finish off by just looking at how to search the database. If you're browsing entries, reading entries, you might be curious how to find more data or to see the data in aggregate. So I'm going to share this little window here. So to start off, the searching the database falls under this feature that we call visualize, because you're both searching and visualizing the results. And so you'll see it when you visit the website. You'll see it right at the top under the tag visualize. So it presents you with this kind of blank search bar. And this is a suggestive search. So you can type in here and it will suggest things that might work for what you're looking for. So for instance, I usually like to start with something about monumental architecture. And so if you give it a little bit of time, there's, as I mentioned, lots and lots of questions in the different polls. There is a question about monumental architecture. So is monumental architecture present? You also notice that there's, in little text, it says there are related questions. And this is because, as I mentioned before, the questions are related behind the scenes between polls. But you notice that it's also suggesting other places where monumental might show up, and so you can use those as guidelines. So we'll start with just the question, is monumental architecture present? And at this point, we're searching the entire database. And so pretty quickly, it gets back to us that there are 444 answers found. And now it's doing a little bit more searching to figure out where those answers are coming from. It says that they're coming from 5 different polls, so the polls that Matt mentioned, but also different versions of those polls, because we've been through different iterations. And so what you're presented with initially is simple pie charts, and you'll notice that there are multiple versions, of course, because these are coming from the group poll and the place poll, but you can kind of read these as the same thing. So the group poll questions on the left, you see a pie chart where kind of 50-50 about whether or not monumental architecture, monumental religious architecture is present globally in all time. So if you ever were wondering about that, here's your answer as per the DRH in our current data set. You also get a map of the world showing you where these yes and no answers are present, or field doesn't know or I don't know answers are present, and also a timeline at the bottom that can be animated. Another cool thing that you can do with this is that you can swap over to the table view. And the table view is, instead of visualizing the pie charts and the map, it's actually just going to give you a list of all of the questions, the entries, and the answers, including the comments and the expert who entered them. This is a good way just to kind of go through the answers and read them as if it were a spreadsheet. But the kind of important thing you can do with this is you can modify these queries. And there's a lot of modifications available. So if I click over to Edit Query, one thing I might be interested in is whether or not monumental architecture is present, but also whether or not there's any imagery. So iconography, other examples. And so here's a question: where is iconography or imagery present? So this is a somewhat specific question, but it implies that iconography or imagery is already present. And when I add that question, I now have a more complex query that consists of 2 questions. If I search that, it's going to find a lot more answers, because now it's searching for 2 different questions and aggregating all of those answers on a kind of global scale. And the visualization is going to be a little bit more complicated because, of course, now there are many different answers that can be part of it. So the visualization is perhaps not as useful at this point. It also takes a lot longer to load because it's trying to bring all these questions onto the map. But in any case, we can, once it gives me my cursor back, there you go. See, it takes a while. There's a lot of answers on this map. We can switch over to the table view if we're curious, and we can see we still get a lot of monumental architecture, but then we would also find the iconography questions and answers later on. So finally, the last thing we can do, which you've already seen some examples of in other places, is that we can filter these results. And so if we drop down the filter bar, you see there's a little bit of an overlap here, but don't worry too much about that. For instance, I could be interested in these 2 questions, but not on a global scale. In fact, I probably shouldn't be interested in these questions on a global scale if I'm being responsible. So in this case, we might say, I'm really only interested in these questions as they pertain to China. So I can make a little polygon there, and I can say, I want to use that area. And then just as we were doing for the entries before, I can say, I'm really only interested in answers that we might find between 600 BCE and 600 CE. So if I pop this filter back up, I've now applied that filter, and if I search again, you'll find that my answers have now drastically reduced. We're only looking at a particular area, basically any entry that overlaps with that area, and then any of the answers that might apply to this time range and to this geographical area. So this is quite interesting, and it's a good way to kind of visualize and search the database. I can switch over to table view again and look at what entries actually are returned here. I can, if I click on this, I can actually go to the entry and read the entry in full, as Matt was showing us. The other really cool thing about this is that these queries are actually saved. If you look at the top at the URL bar, you'll see that this is now query 2316. And I have some previously saved queries here. So this is monumental architecture. Every time you make a new query, they're actually saved in the URL bar, and the database holds on to them. And these can be shared. So you could imagine coming up with an interesting query where you find some results that you find intriguing or maybe questionable, and you could send this URL to someone. And if they visit that same URL, they'll see the same results as you. And they can tweak it as well. They can add some filtering, add another query, and then send you the new URL back. And so it's a way to kind of make this reproducible scholarship in the humanities, right? By allowing other people to see the data that you're working with. So that covers it for the tutorials that we wanted to show for the DRH. So we would encourage you to log on. It's religiondatabase.org. You can browse the entries, you can visualize the entries, you can read individual entries. And if you work broadly on the history of religion from any kind of discipline. We also encourage you to sign up as an expert. You're more than welcome to, and we pay honoraria for completed entries. So we're always looking for new people to contribute to the project. So thank you very much, and bye.
Thank you. I saw a lot of enthusiasm in the chat. Maybe I will steal 1 or 2 minutes from the next talk, or rather we will push the schedule a bit, because I see one question by Cornelis, actually, or 2 questions. We could just answer that and then go on to our next, with our next talk.
Do you want me to answer that in person or type? I'm happy to.
Oh, no, just do it in person this time. So we also add some talk.
Sure.
So where do you see users mostly? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. So where do we see usage come from? I think we would say probably all of the above. I know that's kind of an easy answer to make, but we do really see this as both a research tool and also a reference tool. And then finally, we're in the kind of last stages of putting together actually pedagogical packets so that people can use the DRH in the classroom. So these are actually lesson plans and instructor guides at all different levels to sort of introduce your students into how to think about historical data within a database, but also how to use specifically the features within the DRH. And so those will be up on our website probably by the end of the summer.